Assalamu alaikum and welcome to a very special episode of Pehchaan where we unpack the stories and identities of extraordinary Pakistani Americans. Today, I've got a very special guest with me. Kiran Khalid is the first Pakistani American woman to break into broadcast news in the US. Today, we're going to uncover what it was like to grow up as a brown girl in Texas, and what it was like juggling, breaking into broadcast news by day, and fending off rishta aunties in the evening, and talk about what it's like to be a Pakistani American woman in 2023. So, Kiran, assalamu alaikum, and welcome to the show.
Walaikum salam. I'm so honored to be here and delighted to see you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Kiran. It's an honor to have you on board. And I want to begin with one of the most fascinating moments in your life. This is when you were trying to juggle two different worlds. By day, you were trying to break into the glamorous world of television in Texas, of all places, as a Pakistani American woman, something that had never been done before. And by evening, you were serving chai to aunties who were bringing rishtas to your parents. How did you juggle those two worlds? And were they ripping you apart, or were you actually learning something from one that was helping you in the other?
What I recall from that time is that I was just incredibly frustrated because there was clearly a separation between how my parents viewed my older brother's career trajectory and how seriously they took mine. Like, I think they thought it was neat that I was on TV and I was reporting, but to them, I was somewhat of an underachiever because I had not gotten engaged or married. And I was in my early 20s at that time. I mean, the rishtas started coming, like the talk started probably when I was 17. I dealt with that. And then when I went to college, it was like, okay, but chico parne do, like, so I kept them at bay. And then when I graduated from college, all bets were off. Like, now what are you doing? Right? And it was just frustrating. It was annoying. It was hilarious. It was all of those things.
So, wait a minute. Am I getting this right? That you've sort of broken into television and they're still saying that you haven't achieved enough just because you're not married and you're this first Pakistani American woman who's breaking pathways. I know that, I mean, I get it because I might be a little bit older, but it's just still shocking to just. So, this is right. Like, no matter what you did professionally, it didn't count because you weren't married.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, I remember how. I mean, my family's great.
Mm-hmm.
They're very supportive and lovely people.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had great formative experience as a child, just traveling the world.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, there was definitely this sense.
Mm-hmm.
There was this tangible wistfulness on the part of my mother, my khalas, and my grandmother. You know,
Wow.
um, and in the beginning, it was interesting because I feel like it was overnight, but it was probably gradual. But like when I was 19, there was this shock of gray hair that just surfaced. And, it was like this cognitive dissonance where you have like this young face and then this, and I thought it was the coolest thing, like I was a fan of Indira Gandhi and some people called me that and I loved it. And then when I got into television, I mean at the time, there was no Google or internet, so I wasn't sure if I had any
Mm-hmm.
contemporaries. But as far as I knew, the only Asian American woman who was a role model for me at the time was Connie Chung.
Mm-hmm.
And she was co-anchor for a brief period with Dan Rather, and
Mm-hmm.
and so that was my model. I remember my grandmother saying to me repeatedly that I needed to color my hair because that was the reason I wasn't married. And for me, it was like a distinguishing thing in like this sea of
Mm.
candidates and different people. Like I was like, that's my brand. That's what I'm
Mhm.
gonna hang my hat
Mhm.
on. And eventually, I relented, and here we are, decades later, and I'm still coloring my hair.
Wow. Wow. Well, this means that we can't understand who Kiran is today without understanding what her childhood was like and how she grew up sort of in this context. So, Kiran, take us back to the beginning. What was school like? What was childhood like? Sort of, growing up as a brown girl in Texas. So, take us back.
Yeah, you know, Texas is now a very, I mean, it was then too, a very cosmopolitan place. You know, it has its rural areas, and we happened to live in one that was just outside of Houston, Texas. It's this very small town called Huffman. When I grew up there was a Dairy Queen. There was no grocery store. You had to drive like, I mean, you drove across Lake Houston, which was a man-made lake, and my father was a land developer in the area. We were the only brown family. There were no other Asians. There were no black families. There were no Jews. So in school, you know, I did see, like, I did have Hispanic classmates, but I was pretty much it, and my brother and I. And it was interesting because my brother was very popular and he flourished, and I was a little bit more awkward, and you know, wasn't allowed to date, wasn't allowed to talk to boys, because on both sides of my family, I was the first girl to be raised in the United States, and so there was a lot of trepidation, a lot of paranoia, and those were formative years for me because, you know, there were a lot of ignorant comments and among teachers as well. But what it did was it toughened me up. Like I really had thick skin by the time I got to college because I had dealt with that. And the profession I chose, you have to have a thick skin because every criticism feels personal. It's about how you sound. It's about whether you're telegenic. You know, so it's hard not to take those things personally, but I felt like I had a tougher shell because of my childhood.
So, in some strange way, growing up as a Pakistani American girl actually sort of toughened you up in terms of what you were going through at home and enabled you to sort of take on a lot of systemic sort of pressures when you're trying to break into something like this because it gave you a thicker skin, which is really an interesting insight because you don't always look at it from that angle, even though it's sort of a very difficult position to be in. Um, Talk to us about where this idea of wanting to be on television came from. Was this always something that sort of lit a spark sort of under you, or where did this sort of, what was the genesis of that?
I It's interesting because I remember whenever anyone would turn on the news in the evening as I was growing up, I would just groan like, "Oh, we have to watch this boring stuff." And to this day, I remember the moment when, you know, Zia Huq's plane went down because it was
Mm-hmm.
one of those very rare moments that you heard Pakistan on the news. I remember constantly having to explain where it was. I'd often say, "I'm from
Mm-hmm.
Pakistan. Where's that?" "Oh, it's next to
Mm-hmm.
India." You know,
Mm-hmm.
I'd have to
Mm-hmm.
provide that context, and it was just this really rare moment. And then my mom loves to tell the story, and it's funny because I just recently got back in touch with this colleague who's now
Mm-hmm.
the chief sustainability officer at a major company, and he told his team, because we're going to be working together, that he co-anchored a newscast with me when we were in
Wow.
fifth grade.
Mm-hmm.
And my mom tells a story of me sitting in a box, literally, pretending to be a newscaster. But what I remember is through high school, I just loved journalism. It was my favorite subject. I loved creative writing. Really, really enjoyed that. And when I went to college, I knew that I was going to major in journalism. And I went to the University of Texas at Austin, and they had a very, very impressive, you know, storied journalism program.
Mm-hmm.
And then they had a small sequence that was very competitive. They took 15 students a semester, and, you know, school of tens of thousands, and it was competitive because it was called the broadcast sequence, and it was specifically for people who wanted to break into the television side of news on camera.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, you know, you had a lot of really, really attractive women, but the vetting was all about your street cred. It was all about why did you want to get into this? And I remember in my interviews very clearly stating that I wanted to get into television news because I wanted to be someone in a newsroom who could educate others about my culture, and that I felt a responsibility that that presence was required and that I could fill that void. And that distinction, my professors later told me, was important because not only did it show them that I had a world view as a junior in college, because that's when you got into the program, but also that my motives were pure, because it wasn't about glamour or anything like that.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and the fact that you were co-hosting with somebody you know now in grade five, that's amazing to hear. There's one thing that you said in the middle that was very profound and resulted in a couple of questions in my head. You said, when Zia when his plane went down, that's the first time Pakistan showed up in the news, and that clicked with you because before that, when you had to explain to people where Pakistan was, where you were from, you didn't know what to say. Why did you have to tell people where you're from is Pakistan? So I want to get a few facts straight. Were you born in the US, and if you were, like, were you going to school when people are like, where are you from? Why didn't you just say I'm from here?
Right,
Like,
right. That's a great question, and one that's like I'm constantly to this day answering. I was actually born in Tehran because my mom already had a 1 year old. Actually, it was less than one because my brother's pretty much my Irish twin. He's like 1 year and 12 days older than me. And, my dad was working. And so she went to Tehran, where my grandparents were based. My grandfather worked for the FAO in the United Nations, and they were based there for 13 years. So she was with her parents when she was expecting me. And I was born there. And it's interesting because my mom and her siblings just went to Tehran this past year during the uprising when it was a very volatile situation, but they had booked their flights and they really, really wanted to go back where they had spent their formative years. And she took a picture in front of the hospital where I was born. And
oh
by the way,
wow.
I was really annoyed that they went without me. The whole trip came together, and then I found out about it as they were getting ready to leave, and I was like, "You realize I was born there, and that I should be going with you?" And they were like, "Yeah, but we decided for you because you have small kids, and you couldn't get away." And I was like, "Oh, really? Thanks for letting me know that I couldn't get away." I mean, but they were right, of course. And so that's why I was born there. And then my parents moved to the United States. My father got a visa because he was working for Pan Am, an airline that some of your listeners may remember from
Yeah.
back in the day. And then he was in Houston. We were in Queens. My sister was born there. She's 4 years younger than me. And my whole life, people especially in Texas, I remember this because it happened most frequently there, was, "Oh, where are you from?" And instantly the question was, "Well, my family's from Pakistan." But but I was born in Iran, but I've never been there. I was just born there, right? And I remember, like a few years into my career, I was anchoring the newscast in Lake Charles, Louisiana, which we had the only NBC affiliate in the area, and so a lot of people watched. It was the era of must-see TV. And one night after a newscast, I was filling up my car with gas, and there was a guy across the way, and he was filling up his pickup, and he looked at me, and he was like, "Darling, I watch you on TV all the time. Where are you from?" And I was like, "Well, I'm from Houston, but my family is originally from Pakistan." And he said, "Yep, I knew you looked Egyptian." And I was just like, "All right, okay, so really don't need to go into this anymore. So that geographical thing, I mean, even after, his plane went down, he died in that fiery crash, Pakistan was still very obscure. And when you did hear references in movies, it was always when the scriptwriter wanted to make a reference to a very obscure, unknown country, right? Or a comedian was talking about a primitive culture. Like then you would hear it, and it was just like you would cringe.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
then after 9/11, all bets were off. It's more
Yeah.
pervasive than ever, and not in a good way.
It's so fascinating that we've made so much progress as humanity, sort of when we come to 2023. But a question as simple as where are you from trips even us with so much privilege and education and insight. And there's no right answer. You can't be like, I'm from Pakistan. You can't be like, I'm from New Jersey. Especially if you're new, you're just like, it doesn't make any sense. I remember one of the most funniest where are you from questions that I got asked was, and this was when I just came to the US to study. I was here at Columbia, but it was sort of post 9/11. So where are you from had to be careful. And I went to see my aunt, my puppy, in Orange County because I love Disneyland and I wanted to go to Disneyland. Every Pakistani boy's dream is to go to Disneyland. And this taxi cab driver who was sort of I think Amish, very old school. He picked me up and he's like, "Where are you from?" And I'm like, I didn't want to get into the whole Pakistan thing because I'm like, he's gonna think it's unsafe, all that. So I'm like, okay, I'm from New York because I was studying at Columbia. And he's like, "Oh, New York. I hear that's really unsafe. I can never sort of go to New York because there are muggers outside Central Park." And I'm like, thank God I didn't tell you I'm from Pakistan.
Right.
But it's just, something as simple as where you from. It's always a story. And it's not the one that we're telling. It's the story that's in their minds. And it's just so fascinating. But I want to come from Pakistan was an obscure country and you couldn't explain where you're from till 9/11 and where Pakistan becomes the center of gravity and where everybody knows where Pakistan is from. How did 9/11 change your life as a Pakistani American, particularly someone who was part of public life?
So when 9/11 happened, I had actually stepped away from being on camera,
Mm-hmm.
and I had moved to San Francisco. It's a
Mm-hmm.
funny story because I was working as the morning live reporter for the Fox affiliate in Mobile, Alabama. And
Mm-hmm.
I did a story, it was like Montessori Awareness Day. I mean, a morning reporter in any city, no matter how big or small, struggles for places to go live for during that breakfast news show because
Mm-hmm.
it's nobody wants to wake up that time and go live with you, right? So Christmas tree farms, those kinds of annual stories. But I was at a Montessori and they were explaining the Montessori method, and the kids were adorable. And I remember coming back and going to my news director's office, and I was almost in tears. And I was like, Chuck, I am never going to have those kids. And I'm not going to find my husband because I'm in Mobile, Alabama. And also, I have the worst shift, where you sleep all day. You're basically a vampire. You wake up in the middle of the night. And I was just like exhausted. And there was this whole move to like move me to prime time. So I was doing the evening broadcast after the primetime shows. And they actually let me out of my contract because I was just like, I really need to like get to a metropolitan urban center because up until that moment, my friends joked that I was like following the civil rights movement with my career track because I had started in the Deep South and then I moved to Lake Charles, Louisiana, and then I was in Mobile, Alabama, and they were like, come on, go to a real city. But I don't discount those years because it made me a very enterprising reporter. When you have a
Mm-hmm.
dearth of news and activity
Mm-hmm.
in a city where you're charged with making news or reporting the news, you get really creative and you work your network, you build sources, and those lessons still serve me today. But yeah, so I was
And I
in.
want to sort of pause you for a second here. Was it even harder to build those sources because you were Pakistani American and because you were in the Deep South and other places?
Yeah, it was. I mean, I think people like to an extent in that day, like most people got their news. It was appointment television, right? So you tuned
Mm-hmm.
in to the network news. People were watching Dan Rather, Peter Jennings, Tom Brokaw. Those were stalwarts, and you had your choice, and that's who you watched. And then afterwards, you would have the local news, and so we would still have those eyeballs. And so, in a sense, we were kind of local celebrities. And
Mm-hmm.
so it shifted, right? So it wasn't just like you showing up as an Asian
Mm-hmm.
in a place where we were few and far between, but rather they were intrigued because
Mm-hmm.
you looked exotic or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
and they saw you on TV.
Mm-hmm. That makes
Um,
sense.
so back to your question on nine
Mm-hmm.
eleven and how it changed everything. So I went to San Francisco and I was freelancing for two different affiliates. One was the NBC affiliate and the other was the CBS affiliate, which is like a CBS owned and operated station. It's like one of their flagship stations. And I remember 9/11 happening and feeling anxious, well, just stunned firstly, and then being in the newsroom, we were getting the
Mm-hmm.
unfiltered live feed of what was happening, and that was really hard to see people jumping, and then I Pakistan became this central figure because of their strategic location, and it was clear that military action was imminent and that Pakistan was where it was going to emanate from. And in that moment, I felt like this is the first, maybe only time in my career where my Pakistani heritage informs my reporting and that I could potentially have access that other people don't. And so I bought a ticket to go to Pakistan. Actually, my khala loaned me the money. And I went into the news director's office. And I had never met him, but he had an open door policy, literally. And I walked into his office and I said, listen, I'm Pakistani American, one of your writers. I'm going to Pakistan. I've hired a crew and I'm going to be reporting on, just like the temperature on the ground in terms of people and,
Mm-hmm.
events as these airstrikes start. And you can take my stories, or I can go to the other station that I freelance for and I can offer it to them. And he was like, okay, who are you again? And then I ended up going to Pakistan. I did submit stories for them as well as a few other networks. And my access was essentially the story that I first told was one that had not been told yet, and it was about Pakistani madrasas and how they were being characterized broadly as terrorist
Mm-hmm.
breeding grounds. And I had family connections, and I was allowed to go into a madrasa, which was actually run by a former Chicago
Oh
native,
wow. Mm-hmm.
um, who was married to a distant, well, she was a family friend. I don't think we were related.
Mm-hmm.
And he let me come in. He was fluent in English, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
remember his soundbite was, madrasas have are here because there's no
Mm-hmm.
public school system.
Yeah.
And for the children that they educate, it's more than an education. They're giving them food and shelter from the
Mm-hmm.
heat, while
Mm-hmm.
they're here. And
Mm-hmm.
they're shielding them from child labor. But at the same time, we teach math and science. And yes, Quranic studies are a
Mm-hmm.
part of that. But these
Mm-hmm.
are schools at the end of
Mm-hmm.
the day,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I have no doubt that, at the time it was called the Northwest Frontier, like in the NWFP, sure, like to them, the Taliban were freedom fighters. They were
Mm-hmm.
protecting their
Mm-hmm.
land.
Mm-hmm.
But in the urban centers, I didn't really get that sense. And so
Mm-hmm.
I remember boasting to some of my news buddies, like, yeah, I was the first person in a madrasa. And then
Mm-hmm.
the next week, Christiane Amanpour was there. And of course, my stories aired on local television, and hers was on CNN. And
Mm-hmm.
she's like so senior. She's one of my
Mm-hmm.
idols.
Yeah.
But she was really the one who got the access,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, I got the
Mm-hmm.
access
Mm-hmm.
technically,
Mm-hmm.
but
Mm-hmm.
she was the one, and I was really, really glad that she told that story because after
Yeah.
her work in Bosnia and Sarajevo, like
Mm-hmm.
she gets it in a way other reporters don't.
Yeah. Wow. Um, that's just so interesting about being able to tell a story from a different vantage point, being Pakistani American. I remember this happened to me. I was in journalism school when Bin Laden was killed, and I was in New York, and everybody, it was a very black and white story. It's been done. It's amazing that he sort of justice has finally been served, and I was like, where will this story have a little bit more nuance and color in terms of, some tension? Because otherwise it's very black and white. And I'm like, let me go to Little Pakistan in Brooklyn and see how people are reacting over there. And then the minute I showed up there, the New York Times reporter showed up, a couple of other reporters showed up, and there was this random sort of local politician, Pakistani politician, who started distributing sweets, sort of mithai, to Pakistanis who were crossing across the street. And like a lot of folks were older, the news hadn't broken, they didn't know what had happened, but everybody was having a good time because they were having mithai. And it was just so interesting to see that juxtaposition. There were two older Pakistani aunties who came in who were getting an English language class. And they were like, 60-year-old Pakistani aunties who sort of don't know much about the world. And one is asking the other, like, why are we getting mithai? And the other one is like, you remember those, twin towers that went down? And the other woman's like, no, I have no idea. And then she's trying to explain what 9/11 was. And then, then who bin Laden was. And then he died. And I'm just like, it was such an interesting sort of microcosm of what was happening within that Pakistani community and how sort of there was more tension. But that's where sort of, what makes us unique. And what's interesting about your story is like that's what got you into journalism. Like that's you wanted to be able to present a different viewpoint and be able to use your unique experiences to be able to bring that to the fore. That's so fascinating.
There was another
Talk to
time when
me.
it was
Yeah.
sorry. No, I was just going
No,
to
no,
say
go.
there was another time when I was able to use that background as
Mm-hmm.
my access card, right? So I was a
Mm-hmm.
reporter for the ABC affiliate in Las Vegas.
Mm-hmm.
And there was, this rise of Islamophobia, of course, but also hate
Mm-hmm.
crimes and
Mm-hmm.
threats against the Muslim community.
Mm-hmm.
And because they had seen me on TV, a
Mm-hmm.
local masjid contacted me and they said, we
Mm-hmm.
have these really frightening voicemails with
Mm-hmm.
threats. And I
Mm-hmm.
said, is the FBI investigating? And they said, yes. And
Mm-hmm.
so I said, do you have the voicemails? And he said, yes.
Mm-hmm.
So I went
Mm-hmm.
and I did that story. And we played those voicemails.
Mm-hmm.
And, it was kind of a scoop that the FBI was investigating
Mm-hmm.
locally
Mm-hmm.
hate crimes
Mm-hmm.
against Muslims. But the reason why they were terrified, this
Mm-hmm.
this community, the ones who attended this masjid and the the imam and other heads of the masjid, people on the board they they were comfortable speaking to me because of my
Mm-hmm.
background. And I didn't
Mm-hmm.
report it any differently than I would
Mm-hmm.
anything else.
Mm-hmm.
But there was that inherent trust embedded before I
Mm-hmm.
even walked in the door.
Yeah. No, that's true, and it is, and this is why it's so important for the path that you broke as a Pakistani American woman, because it's not just important that you were able to do this yourself, but you were able to show other Pakistani American women, and frankly men also, the way in terms of how they could do something like this. And now we've got Amna Nawaz, who is doing the fabulous work that she's doing on PBS, and sort of this is also partly the reason why sort of I wanted to do this podcast is because we don't know our stories as a Pakistani American community. Like we haven't told our own stories, and we don't know our stories. Forget telling the mainstream American public, we haven't told our stories to ourselves. Like there is whether it's sort of the post 9/11 trauma, whether it's just the fact that we're a conservative sort of community who doesn't sort of talk or celebrate each other, like nobody has told our story, and that's why it's important for us to be able to do that. And you've been a trailblazer in that space. So one of the other trails that you blazed was making your way up to CNN, sort of, through your career journey. Talk to us a little bit about that in terms of how that happened and what you learned, sort of from there.
Yeah, so I was reluctant to completely make the shift from
Mm-hmm.
behind the scenes, um, or rather from in front of the camera to behind the
Mm-hmm.
scenes. So when I went to New York, it was as you well know, most saturated
Mm-hmm.
media market.
Mm-hmm.
But also, I had a really strong sense of wanderlust before I arrived
Mm-hmm.
in New York, and I remember it
Mm-hmm.
evaporated instantly because I thought I am at the center of the universe. I had my finger on
Mm-hmm.
the pulse of like everything that's happening in media because it's all here, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, all roads lead to New York City when, or
Mm-hmm.
emanate from there, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I got there and I started freelancing for a local television station in New Jersey. And it was
Mm-hmm.
interesting because New Jersey's television market is sandwiched by New York and Philly.
Mm-hmm.
So those were the stations that covered those communities. They didn't have their own local news except for a cable station called News 12 New Jersey.
Mm-hmm.
And I worked out of their offices in Edison, was reporting, and it was the money I was making was like offset by the commute, like the train
Mm-hmm.
ticket. And then when I got to the train, I had to take a cab to the station. And it was a schlep, but I wanted to keep my reel fresh.
Mm-hmm.
And to make money, I was working as a writer and producer for I don't know if you'll remember this, but they were called video news releases and
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we
the
in ours.
satellite media interviews.
Mm-hmm.
So I
Mm-hmm.
was doing that for a broadcast PR company
Mm-hmm.
called Media Link at the time,
Mm-hmm.
the PR Newswire later, and
Mm-hmm.
really did want to break in back into news. And I had an opportunity to be field producer for Court TV, and that
Mm-hmm.
involved traveling the country and covering
Mm-hmm.
trials that were bizarre or high profile. And then I had the opportunity to go to Good Morning America to be a writer because a friend of
Mm-hmm.
mine was like, hey, if you want to come to GMA, my
Mm-hmm.
boss is looking for a good writer.
Wow.
And
Mm-hmm.
so I went in and I was hired as a freelancer there. And then, you know, like writing stories for Diane Sawyer,
Wow.
regularly working with
Mm-hmm.
correspondents I had admired, Sam
Mm-hmm.
Champion, Robin Roberts, you know, like all, you know, I remember, I remember doing like during the whole run up in the campaign. People may not remember this, but it was a very, very contentious Democratic primary race between Obama and Hillary Clinton.
Mm-hmm.
They were neck and neck,
Mm-hmm.
and when I and Jake Tapper was covering that, and I remember when I was producing for him, I was called a catcher, which meant that
Mm-hmm.
I worked an overnight shift, and you'd come in, and you would there would be a story that had just cropped up, and you were in charge of pulling it together, or there was a correspondent who would be feeding their video and information in, and then you would package it, and it needed to
Mm-hmm.
air at 7 a.m. And when I was catching for Jake Tapper, like it was seamless. He knew
Mm-hmm.
exactly what soundbite he wanted. He knew where to pick it up.
Mm-hmm.
Where he
Mm-hmm.
would tell you, like, pick it up here and then
Mm-hmm.
cut out at this word.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
And he just like knew his stuff so well.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I remember being like, he's really, really good, but
Mm-hmm.
he makes my job irrelevant.
Mm-hmm.
And working with the other
Mm-hmm.
correspondents, I worked a lot with Biana Golodriga, who at the
Mm-hmm.
time was, she had just come over from CNBC. She was a producer on Maria Bartolome, you know, I can't say her name
Thomas.
right
Yep.
now.
Yep. Yep. I know who you're
Um,
talking about.
but she she hadn't put together packages that she was voicing, so I worked with her a lot on those, and it was great. It was great. I really enjoyed it. And then during the subprime mortgage crisis, as lots of industries went under, and advertising dollars that came from the auto industry, in particular, like that dried up. Remember, like
Mm-hmm.
they needed a bailout too,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and that really impacted advertising on the morning shows. And
Mm-hmm.
so while covering the recession and telling stories about, a financial analyst turned barista at Starbucks, I suddenly found myself in the same shoes where they were, freelancers were going to be the first ones that they let go. And that was really hard. And I was kind of like, after that, I remember I had a blog and I talked about being a recessionista, trying to make it glamorous, and did a fellowship
Mm-hmm.
in Ethiopia. So I went to the World Water Forum, and then we went to Addis Ababa in Ethiopia to report on water issues.
Wow.
And that was really like an eye-opening experience for me.
Mm-hmm.
And after that, I was interviewed on Brian Lair, and then I was teaching at the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism, and I ran into an executive producer at CNN, and she
Mm-hmm.
brought me in as a freelancer. And
Mm-hmm.
then after that, I just hit the ground running. But for me, that was the end all be all to be at
Mm-hmm.
CNN, um, even as a producer, because I had this
Mm-hmm.
vast platform on
Mm-hmm.
which I could tell underreported
Mm-hmm.
stories, and it was great. It was a
Yeah.
great run.
Absolutely. And you'd sort of made it like every Pakistani sort of growing up. And I've been a news junkie since I was a kid. All I would watch is sort of CNN. And that was sort of, and to see a Pakistani American there, like it was, and at that time, now it appears easy. I think a lot has sort of changed. But I think to be able to see that and to happen at that time was extraordinary. You talked about underrepresented stories. Um, how do you feel your identity as a Pakistani American has evolved through your career and also through the trajectory of your life? Like, when you were sort of a child, would you sort of run away from your Pakistaniness or resent it in any way? Whereas you wanted to be more American, and then as your career started, it feels like being Pakistani was an important part of you. It was sort of a voice that you wanted to sort of bring out. And then, sort of, as you get married and have kids, did your Pakistaniness have a resurgence? Did it have an identity crisis? I want to talk to me about the arc of your identity through your life.
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I never felt like I was straddling two cultures
Mm-hmm.
because my Pakistani culture, maybe because of the pressure I felt, was such a prominent force in my life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and then, yeah, as I, got into my career and became independent, it was more of a code switch situation. But you weren't only doing it based on how you talk, how you spoke and showed up, but also how you dressed.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I know one of my, or a few of my relatives really didn't like sleeveless. Like, I don't even know if
Mm-hmm.
this would pass muster,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so remembering not to wear that in front of them.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and of course, growing up and even as an adult, like I never wore shorts. That was frowned upon.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and and so in that respect, I don't know that I really felt that. And then being Pakistani American, for a while it took a back seat early on in my career because it was made clear to me, I had more than one person suggest I change my last name to a Hispanic
Mm.
surname because they were like, oh,
Oh
you could pass
wow.
for Latina, maybe you should go by Lopez. And I was like,
Wow.
yeah, no, I'm not going to do that. But it was, and there was all this debate around affirmative action, and Asians were always seen as the model minority. So I always felt like I have this, I have something that doesn't necessarily hold me back, but it's certainly not an asset, right? It felt
Mm.
more like a liability. So it wasn't something that
Mm-hmm.
I could really lean into. It wasn't something that I ran away from. But in that moment, when 9/11 happened, it all, came together. It was just like my purpose felt crystallized in the sense that yeah, I had something I could offer. I could talk in the newsroom about the difference between Shia and Sunni, and it was germane to what was being covered. I could call the control room when they had a headline at CNN that said, "Four Muslims go to
Mm-hmm.
court," and I said, "You would never identify any white defendants by their religion. So why are you, you can say four suspected terrorists. There's, alleged
Mm-hmm.
terrorists. There's so many ways
Mm-hmm.
to describe them, but you chose to brand them by a religion, which is something that can't even be substantiated. So
Mm-hmm.
they changed it, and that was
Mm.
that was a moment for me where I was like, okay, I'm doing something.
I am still angry and emotional at whoever suggested that you be Kiran Lopez. I mean, what a different interview we would be having if you were Kiran Lopez, and what a different impact. I mean, it just, I know that we took it on the chin, and the way that you say it, you're just completely unemotional, and you're just like, yeah, that happened. Um, but it's so outrageous, like that was just normal.
Yeah, yeah, that it was suggested. And that's the thing, like, I'm so proud of Amna Nawaz, and I've known her for a
Hmm.
long time. Um, I stayed at her apartment when my documentary was shown at the National Press Club. And there have been a lot of media that have have honed in on the fact that she's Pakistani American. And
Hmm.
Amna has every single accolade you could get in journalism. She has a
Hmm.
DuPont, she has a Peabody, I'm
Hmm.
pretty sure she has a
Hmm.
Murrow, she was inducted into the
Hmm.
Gridiron Club, you
Hmm.
know? And I just feel like for her, her path was different than those of us who started in the beginning, but she's
Hmm.
at the pinnacle. And
Hmm.
it
Hmm.
represents how far we've come,
Hmm. Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And we also have to remember like what it was like in the beginning too.
Hmm. Yeah. And they were each stepping stones. I think neither could have happened without the other. Like it's important for those trails to be blazed. Wow. I also, another thing, and I know that your family's about to come back home, so I'm sort of skipping a few questions, getting to at least the
Yeah.
things that I really want to cover, and then if we have a little bit more time, we can keep going. But
Yep.
um, one of the things that you said was, you were the only girl who was being the first girl to be raised in the U.S. from your dada side and from your nana side. So you were the first girl, and that obviously, like, your parents were probably experimenting on how to grow up, like how to raise a Pakistani American girl. How did that translate into parenthood for you, as you raise your kids, and when it comes to their identity? Because I feel like, all these I've been going through identity crisis about being Pakistani or Pakistani American, which is why I'm starting this podcast. But none of it became real for me till I had a kid,
Mm-hmm.
because then the choices were real. Like for me, my identity was an intellectual debate in my head. And the minute there's a child, it's no longer intellectual, it's physical. It's, do I do this or do I do that? Do I feed them this? Do I send them to this school? Do I, you know, the intensity and the urgency of those questions, you can't like look away. How do you think the way you were parented influences the way that you're parenting now, and how does your identity translate into your parenting?
Well, I have a lot of empathy for my
Mhm.
parents now that I'm a mother, in terms of the protectionism, right? Wasn't allowed to go to slumber parties. They were very, very strict. And with my sister, who was 4 years younger, it was a completely different experience. And so, likewise,
Mm.
for my daughter, it's going to be like this generational shift and also a different experience because I don't want to clamp down to that
Mm.
extent. The values that I want to instill in my daughter in particular are ones that, yeah, promote modesty to an extent, and tolerance for other religions. Um, my father was always very adamant that I not talk about politics or religion in any circle at any time outside of the home. And I get it, a lot of debates. And now we're in an era of identity politics. It's all very real and very personal for so many
Mhm.
of us. But I think that her Pakistani heritage informs who she is, but it doesn't
Mhm.
define who she is.
Mm.
And for me, it was different. It was about definition.
That's such a powerful thought, that, in our cases, it became the defining feature of our identity, both because it was more recent for us, and also like the world, 9/11 and all of those things meant that we couldn't choose how to define ourselves. We were being defined. But for them, it's one of the many ways in which, it'll inform and influence them, but they've got a much sort of bigger runway.
I mean, they've just got like a different world. There's a
Mhm.
Marvel superhero. You
Mhm.
have Charmine, you know,
Mhm.
directing the first woman of color to direct
Mhm.
a film from the Star Wars franchise. Like,
Mhm.
what? You have Amna, who
Mhm.
moderated a presidential debate and
Mhm.
now sits
Mhm.
at the helm of the most storied, respected anchor desk,
Mhm.
across the broadcast landscape.
Mhm.
It's unbelievable. Like, the
Yeah.
strides we've made. We are part of the cultural fabric in this country in a way that we have never been before. And so for
Yeah.
our children, they have those touch points. That sense of otherness is largely diminished because of those cultural touch points and the prominence of those people in the media. And I think that's fantastic.
Yeah. I agree. I think that the Pakistani American community is really sort of coming at the cusp of breaking into mainstream. I think we already have in many ways into the cultural fabric, but the party is just getting started. Like I think we've put a lot of work in, and you mentioned Amna, you mentioned Sharmeen Obaid with Marvel, Aruj Aftab, a Grammy, Kumail Nanjiani, like Chippendales, not like your typical Indian consultant, like
Right.
like doing the thing, and it's
I
just
just saw Aruj
remarkable.
in concert last night, by the way.
Wow, I mean, what an extraordinary story! What an extraordinary human being. Um, where do you think, and this is sort of, my final question or thought is, you know, having been such a trailblazer in this community, now seeing how this community is sort of maturing and sort of entering the mainstream, where do you think we're going next? And what do we need to do as a community to continue to thrive and sort of find our space, sort of in this moment?
I'm really proud of some of the efforts underway to, the civic engagement we promote with the American Pakistan Foundation. I mean, it's
Mm-hmm.
an apolitical organization. They
Mm-hmm.
maintain that apolitical stance across
Mm-hmm.
board communications and everything else they do. It's really about having Pakistani Americans become more engaged in civic government at every level, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that's a first step because that's something we cannot be insular and then expect to be included at the same time. And
Mm-hmm.
so getting out and voting, participating in campaigns. Then you have the Polygon, which is run by
Mm-hmm.
Warda Khalid, where she's done all this work educating, lawmakers on the Hill, and
Mm-hmm.
that organization is growing by leaps and bounds. And you have the Pillar Fund, which
Mm-hmm.
is, I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's like this Muslim philanthropists, and their whole purpose is
Mm-hmm.
to enable Muslims to be able to grow, incubate their
Mm-hmm.
ideas and programs. And it's run by Pakistanis. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm really heartened by all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And also Kalsum Lakhani, like she's
Mm-hmm.
amazing what she's doing.
Mm-hmm.
Shazia Khan with Eco Energy
Mm-hmm.
Finance, where
Mm-hmm.
she's like putting solar power in off the grid communities in Pakistan. So I'm really impressed with that, but we need to do more, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it'll never be enough. Like that push, we're behind. If you look
Mm-hmm.
at the Jewish lobby, if you look
Mm-hmm.
at Indian American
Mm-hmm.
organizations, they really embraced their identity and fought for its inclusion
Mm-hmm.
and put the money and the manpower behind it to bring those goals to fruition.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we as a collective Pakistani society have yet to do that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think long way for us to go, but I think for the first time we can feel a little bit of momentum behind us. We can feel like there are a couple of wins that we can point to,
Absolutely.
and sort of. I think the biggest thing that I think the transformation is we're moving out of this mindset of being defeatist and feeling like there's nothing that we can do right to saying, you know what, there is a pathway, we can do things right. There's a long way to go, but and the examples that you gave are exactly the ones that sort of inspire us. Kiran, it was an absolute joy to have you here, but I'm still so emotional. I think the Kiran Lopez part is still
Oh,
sort of burning me up, but I'm just like, what you did for all of us. Frankly, like even sort of starting this podcast, there wouldn't be a community, there wouldn't be Pakistani Americans in public life, sort of doing the things that they were doing, um, unless you had fought the battles that you had fought. And it's so. I'm actually going to bring you on back again, sort of in a little while, because like there's so many things that you just said in a matter of fact way. Yeah, this happened and then this happened and I was going through this, and it just shows the strength and the thick skin that you've developed over so long, where is just a matter of fact to you, but it's actually on your shoulders that this community is now beginning to stand, and the shoulders of many others like you, who sort of paved the way for us. So
I'm
thank you, and
Yeah,
yeah.
I just want to say, Bilal, that you know you're no slouch, right? So
Mm-hmm,
without trading accolades, I mean, 40
mm-hmm,
under 40 on the PR list, right? That is such a
mm-hmm,
distinction. So kudos to you for that. And I'm very proud of my accomplishments, and I'm thrilled to be here today and share what I've learned. But I think it's really important to note that I may have been the first one who like pounded my way through the door,
mm-hmm,
but I don't discount the journey of any other Pakistani
mm-hmm,
American who's gone through this. Because even for
mm-hmm,
Amna, despite the
mm-hmm,
fact that I may have walked in a door in a local
mm-hmm,
market before her, she blazed a trail at the network level
mm-hmm,
that's unprecedented
mm-hmm,
for
yeah,
Pakistani Americans, right?
mm-hmm,
So technically, she wasn't the first, but
mm-hmm,
that trail was an
yeah,
uncharted path, right?
mm-hmm,
And same with
yeah,
Aisha Sultan, who was like the
mm-hmm,
first syndicated Pakistani American columnist. She works with the
mm-hmm,
St. Louis Post Dispatch. She and I have
mm-hmm,
known each other since college. And so
mm-hmm,
I think to your earlier point about Pakistanis stepping up and lifting each other up, I think we
mm-hmm,
can all champion each other's accomplishments. Um, and just build on that momentum, because being first is is great, right?
mm-hmm.
But leading the pack or pushing the pack along is just so much more important to me.
Absolutely. No, that's very heartwarming. And, we were chatting this before we started the recording, but that's the real purpose of this podcast as well, which is, there's this trope that, Indian Americans lift each other up or other communities lift each other up, but Pakistani Americans sort of pull each other's legs and sort of throw people down. And that's what I'm really trying to bust through this podcast and really sort of create a community that nurtures each other's success and celebrates each other's success. Because we are like there are so many extraordinary human beings in our community, and they all deserve to be celebrated so that we can inspire sort of the next generation of our community. Kiran, thank you so much. I know the next generation of your family is about to come back home from swimming class
That's
and
right.
sort of storm your day. So thank you for your time. I really appreciate you.